local IGDA chapter. I'm also a game programmer up at Wildworks, which is a studio downtown. If you haven't heard about the IGDA, you can go to igda.org, and our chapter is igda.org/SLC. And there's a mailing list there, or you can put your email down here, and you can hear future announcements. We have meetings every couple of months, and I run events like the Global Game Jam, where you can get practice working on a game with a team for free. I'd like to thank a couple of sponsors. Obviously, UVU, thank you for sponsoring the space, and a big thanks to the IGDA Foundation, which is funding the fight and making this possible today. One quick announcement: we do have a big event coming up on Thursday, March 31st at 7 p.m. This will be downtown Salt Lake City at the Newmont University down there. We're going to have Katie Perez coming, and if you don't know, that's the senior program manager at Microsoft for the ID at Xbox program. So she's coming out to help anyone that would want to learn more about producing games for the Xbox and for Microsoft platforms, and that's going to be a pretty big event as well. So tonight we have Kimberly Unger, and I'm sure you've all read the blurb I gave on the flyers and everything, so let's just take it away.
All right. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I've just realized that this is the wrong lecture, so we'll go to something a little more game-oriented. We're all friends, right? We can pretend we didn't see the first slide. Right? So I'm here to talk about a couple of topics today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my backstory and about my path through the games industry, because it kind of went in a lot of weird directions, and I think that's ultimately the strength of what I'm doing now. And then I'm going to shift into talking about my studio, Bushigo, which I started a couple of years ago and is now up and running in the San Mateo, city of San Mateo in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that we have done to ensure our survival over time, because we are up in San Francisco, we are a target-rich environment. So we've had to come up with some clever ways to keep the studio running and to make sure that we can keep providing for our employees and for our contractors and sort of keep things viable over a longer period of time. So first things first, I'm currently the CEO at Bushigo. It's actually my second game startup. My first one was called Bellicode and was focusing on everybody seen Defiance, right? The TV video game hybrid. So originally, I had started a studio many years ago with an idea towards creating a similar product. It was way too freaking early. There was not enough bandwidth on the planet to handle something like that. So we shelved that, and eventually the new company I've started is focusing on mobile games and mobile entertainment apps. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Other stuff that I do, I lecture at UC Santa Cruz for their master's degree program in games and playable media. I am the arts intersection for that degree program. The people who come in, we've got about a 70-30 split of programmers to artists most of the time. And through the course of the degree program, people take on different roles. And so part of my job is making sure that not only do both sides communicate properly, but that both sides are at a point where they can execute their own artwork. Or if artwork comes back in, then they understand what to do with it and how to make adjustments to it, even if they don't have an artist on staff or even if they don't have a programmer on staff. We go through a lot of the common problems that you see when you're working in the games industry when art comes back and has to be locked into the code. I've been a freelance artist since about 2002, almost exclusively in mobile, although I do still do AAA work here and there. I call myself a triage specialist. I'm the person you call at 2 in the morning when the build has crashed and your artist is at Burning Man, which happens more often than you might think in the Bay Area. So I am kind of a super generalist. I do 2D artwork, I do vector-based graphics, I do pixel painting, I do 3D art and animation. I'm well versed in both Maya and 3ds Max. Lightwave I was never quite able to get my head around, but it is a good, solid program if that's your preference. And then and when I was full-time employed, it was strictly as a 2D, 3D artist working. I started working in the industry as a high-resolution texture painter, so hyper-realistic, photorealistic textures. I painted all the cat lips in Stuart Little, which has cured me of ever being a crazy cat lady. And from there I was working on high-resolution textures for a motion simulator ride down at Reuben H. Fleet in San Diego. That was all hyper-photorealistic. Went through several iterations. Deep Impact came out and completely jacked up our entire thought process on what comets looked like. Creeping featureitis is something that you really do have to be careful of in this industry, because when new cool things pop up, everybody immediately goes, but it's got to look just like. And part of your job as the artist is to pull the producers back and say, no, this will be better. Really, we can kick their butt with what we're doing now. So that's my official resume in the games industry. I'm also an author. I've written 2 textbooks that are entree texts for mobile gaming and for game design. And I do other bits and bobs here and there. I was an investment professional for a while. I was a stockbroker for a little bit. I've done a bunch of other pieces here and there that feed into the business end of where I am now. So when you tell your friends or your family, or you're talking to somebody you met in the bar and they ask what it is that you do, most of the time you're going to give them an answer that's kind of like this. And for most people on the planet, when you say you're a game developer, they think of a single monolithic idea, right? That's sort of your high concept of what it is that you do. And a lot of people think that it's a straight line to get from point A to point B. For a lot of professions, it can be. You go to high school, then you go to college and you get your degree in X, Y, and Z, and then you get out and you get a job in X, Y, and Z, and bop, 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 and then you're retired and you have grandkids and everything worked out in the end. In the creative industries in particular, it doesn't work like that. And whether you're on the art side or on the code side or on the audio side, I do tend to regard games as a creative industry, because input comes from everywhere. We have had brilliant games designed by programmers. We've had really excellent games designed by artists. So that ability to have input into this process can come from anywhere in the industry. And you'll have studios that do roundtables and that do stand-ups every so often to pull ideas from within the company for just that reason, because we all know that, that this person or that person or the other person over there may have the idea that's going to save this game. And so very few things get discounted. And so you end up with a career path that looks a little more like this most of the time. And for any of you who are industry professionals, you know how this goes, right? You pick up a freelance gig here, which was really fun to do, but didn't actually lead anywhere. And then you went and did that banking software for that guy that you met in grad school. And then you got hired by a studio, but then that studio got picked up by a bigger studio as an acqui-hire, which means they let all of their people go because they just wanted to acquire an IP or they just wanted to acquire a piece of technology. As we've just seen, even the biggest and the biggest budget AAA level studios get axed, right, on a fairly regular basis. So you don't have a straight path through the games industry. There are a few situations where that's happened. Jobs like lead engine programmer, right, or lead engineer for something like Rockstar's Rage engine, right? The people who've coded that originally are still there, and they will be there for a long time because they know every secret that is hidden in the code. Same thing with John Carmack, who was with id Software forever and ever and ever, because he understood their source code better than any living human on the planet. But for 99.5% of us, this is what we're going to end up with. And if you go into the industry knowing that this is the sort of the frothy, choppy type of career path that you're going to end up with, it can be worked with. If there's going to be points where it's troublesome. There's going to be points where you pour all your heart into something and it's not going to go anywhere. But eventually, from a distance, and when you look back on your career, what you see ultimately is something that looks a little bit more like this. All right, so where's my next set of notes? Okay, so a little bit of backstory. I programmed my first game for the Apple IIe, and by first I mean from loading screen all the way to end credits. I worked on it with another programmer. There were two of us building it together. It was a lot of fun. It was kind of complicated, but this is actually where I first got introduced to the idea of computer graphics in general, because everything had to be written out manually. Right? If you wanted to put a pixel on the screen, you had to type in H plot this location, V plot this location, and everything had to be plotted out. So we could draw our stuff out on graph paper, right? And then literally just write the numbers into the code, and you would have a picture. And you could, and you had to do the colors manually too, which was green at the time. But the color variance, if you were fortunate enough to have a color screen, which no one I ever knew had color. We knew one guy who had an orange screen instead of a green screen, which was really, really special. But the colors would change the intensity of the pixel. So you could still get sort of a black and white type grayscale image if you were really determined to get that. And so we did a lot of, this was early 1980s, right? So the consumer computer was a new thing. Being able to have a computer in your home was new and exciting. And the school that I attended basically gave us a whole bunch of computers and said, here's the book, go make great things, right? Which was, for a bunch of 10, 11, 12-year-olds was the coolest thing ever. And so we would whoever got a game would bring it in, and we'd spend like a week hacking it. And we'd figure out how they did everything. We'd figure out how they were creating the illusion of depth within any given screen. And we were figuring out how they were calling their enemies and how they were making the enemies explode when you shot them. How they were building little mini sort of database type things. Weren't really like what we have now database-wise. We spent a lot of time hacking around and figuring that out. And then when I got out of this school and I transitioned to high school, I got away from computers entirely. And I got away from art entirely for a long time. A big percentage of that was access. The school that I transferred to took computers very seriously. In the old IBM, you don't touch this unless you have a degree kind of seriously. Everything was hyper-regulated. Students were not permitted in the classroom. We could not turn the computers on without having an adult present. And so, coming from ultimate freedom where I can break anything I want to, okay, here are the rules, that was, at 12 years old, you're out. You're like, if I don't have to be here, I'm done. So I had a hiatus for a few years. I got back into art. And then when I went to college, I did my first undergrad up at UC Davis. I had access to everything. I had a lab full of Spark stations and probably a dozen kids in that lab who were perfectly willing to help me figure stuff out, right? And so as I continued working with computers and as I continued moving into working with art on computers, first by coding it in manually and then by moving to things like Photoshop, this was all assemblage. Right. My first degree is in English. All right. This is not necessarily conducive. The games I make these days are primarily narrative games, so I have a huge pool of information and cultural canon that I can draw on when I make my games from my English major. But all the things that I use in games were things that I found, right? Things that I went out and said, I need to make this thing go. I'm going to go talk to that guy over there. I have had no formal computer class training through any of this. I tried to get into a computer class once, and they asked me to leave because I wasn't a CS major, I was an English major, and I'm not sure they could wrap their head around the idea that an English major might want to learn how to code, so I just went back to the lab and continued making more stuff. And, at this point, there's a pattern, right? No matter what I'm doing, no matter what my formal path in life happened to be, I was going out and I was collecting things. I was building my own things. I was figuring out how to use software that, very few people knew how to use. By the end of college, I was teaching myself 3D animation. I had an Amiga 3000 and was using some of the open source software that was available to actually do 3D animations and 3D renderings. And this was the early old school stuff. This is back when Alias was still written in Fortran. So very, very polygon heavy. Lawnmower Man era, if any of you guys remember. I have witnessed, you can see the shutter, witnessed a Lawnmower Man, which for the time was brilliant, but it wasn't until Pixar that we figured out what to do with art and computer animation. So eventually, fast forward a couple of years, I spent a couple of years as a stockbroker. I spent a couple of years working in the business side of things. I started one or two small businesses and either completely misfired or I sold them off for pennies because that's what they were worth to me at the time. And I eventually decided that if I was going to do games and if I was going to stop, hanging out in my room and farting around and doing stuff like, adding my coworkers' faces to Doom, I had to actually go in and do something with it, right? I actually had to make a commitment at that point. So I went and I applied to a couple of art schools. I got into the Art Center College of Design. And I went in as an illustration major, which is their catch-all major. If you don't know what you want to do, you end up as an illustration major. And I ended up spending the next 3 years retconning my degree. So I managed to swap out classes from transportation design. I swapped in classes from production design. I swapped in, I think I skipped all of the actual formal computing art classes that they were teaching because at that point I was the TA for the art classes because I was the only one who could get in and kill a process from a computer down the hallway when something crashed. And so by the time I was done there, I was teaching Maya 1, I was teaching Alias at both Art Center and Santa Monica College, and I had started to pick up my first game jobs. And when I went to school at Art Center, I went with the idea that I was going to go into games or I was going to go into CGI. I mean, I was not going there to become an artist in the classical sense and paint nudes or work in advertising or animate for Disney. I was going into computer digital art, which is possibly one of the things that actually got me in, is that I had a clear focus. And it was a weird focus for the illustration major, I will have to say. I don't know many illustration majors. Everybody I know, they're from trans or they're from product design, because I spent so much time messing with their gear. And so when I started getting into what I got out of that degree program, I went to work for my first game studio, which was called Creative Minds. And we were making a game for Donald Trump. Which is fairly poetic. It was supposed to be a real estate trading game, and we were convinced we could make it in first person. And the comparison point that it made, it was supposed to be a first-person real estate trading game on a par with Duke Nukem. What? I don't know where this pitch came from. This is how it was given to me.
Please tell me he's the main supervillain.
The game actually never got finished. It was a very small studio. It was one programmer who had tried to make the entire game himself, but got to a point where he had to bring in other personnel. We got up to the point of building a demo for the game and actually building a working model of the game. And then everything sort of came unglued, and the studio ended up folding, and they weren't able to complete the product. Which is actually probably for the best at the end of the day. And then from there, I went working in textures, worked on Stuart Little. Then I transitioned completely into games with Starsphere Interactive. We were working on the very first port of Civilization for the PlayStation 2. And this was when PlayStation 2 was still in the works, so we had early prototype stuff. And putting Civilization on a console is a nightmare. I am stunned that they even managed it for the Xbox. And the thing that we ran across was we would have had to redesign the game. right? I mean, Civilization, for those of you who haven't played Civ or Civ 2, 3, 4, 5, 20, Space, Future, it is a very deep resource management game, time and resource management. You're trying to take over the world. And there's layers and layers, and you have technology trees that will cover this entire wall if you were to try and draw them out. And trying to cram all that into a console was not going to happen. And we weren't allowed to do a redesign. We had to attempt to replicate the game exactly. So that didn't go very far at the end of the day. We got some really cool solutions out of it, some really cool rendering techniques out of it on the technical side, but the game itself didn't quite go. But one of the things I kept running across when I worked at all of these different studios was that I kept running back and forth between the art station and the programming stations. And when I worked at Rhythm and Hues, artists were all the way up here on like the 4th floor, and the programmers were all the way down here in the basement. And so I would, and this was before we had stuff like Allegria, where you could actually paint on a surface. So we had to unwrap the surface of our model and paint on it, while it was flat. And so what would happen is I'd have to load a texture, and then if I wanted to see what it looked like on the model, I had to run downstairs to my programmer and say, hey, can you throw this up on the screen for me? I've done another update. And so I ran up and down a lot of stairs. And this continued. When I went to different studios, what I found is I kept having to harass the programmers whenever I had tricky assets or complicated assets that were being dropped into whatever game engine we were using. Because I was working with small studios, a lot of those studios had their own proprietary engines. This was the era where if you wanted to be somebody, you had to have your own engine, right? That's what people were funding. They weren't funding your games. They were funding the possibility of having the next Quake engine or the next Unreal engine. And eventually what happened is I would work with the programmers to build in-house tools. And I have copies of probably 20 different tool sets that we built. And then it got to the point where the programmer would give me the tool and then I'd start tweaking it. I'd be, well, show me where this piece of programming is, and I'll tweak this here and I'll tweak that there. Because I had, from back when I was programming for the Apple IIe, I had an understanding of programming structure. Things like order of operations, how things are executed, how you separate one piece of code from another, how two pieces of code may talk to each other within any given program. And so eventually I would get tools that would allow me to deliver different art assets even more quickly. Because there is nothing I hate more than lag. Whether it be on my computer or in real life, that length of time between when I can deliver an asset and move on to the next asset, I like that to be as short as humanly possible. So fast forward another year or two. At that point, I was mostly fnoodling about, right? I was taking other people's code and breaking it, and adjusting integers here and there. And the kicker for me, going from being an artist to being a programmer, was when I went freelance. So one of the studios that I was working for, Blue Planet Software, finally went belly up. And I said, you know what? I'm going to hang out my shingle and see how it does, right? And like every single person in this room, I had a stack of game ideas like this big that I wanted to get made. And I had pitched game ideas to to the different studios that I'd worked at before. None of them had ever gone anywhere, but I still had them. And I still wanted to see if I could make something out of them. And I had the advantage of being an artist in that I could build my design document, and I could do lots of pretty renders and concept art. But at this point in time, back in the 90s, the big studios funded a lot of games based on pretty concept art and good design documents. And a lot of those games went, right? So by the time I got around to doing my own pitching, I now had to have a demo. Right. So, and that was the only way you could even get in the door. You would call the producer would say, great, send me your design document. You'd send over the design document, and they'd go, this looks fabulous, where's the demo? And you go, they're like, call me when you have a demo. And that was the end of many, many conversations. And no demo, no meeting. So I put together a couple of different small teams from various mod communities, and we started building demos. Pretty much all of these that you're looking at here, these are all based on Unreal Tournament and Unreal Tournament 2 engine graphics. And so we would build demos, and we were throwing lots of ideas at the wall to see what we could get to stick. And then when the mobile industry kicked into gear, I figured it would be easier for me to get funding for a smaller gamble, right, for building a game for mobile. A lot of my freelance work had started taking me into working with mobile. I worked on the Incredibles mobile game, I worked on the Van Helsing mobile game, I did some stuff for Major League Baseball, a couple of OEM releases for Nokia were in the works. So I had a good handle. Not only did I have a good handle on mobile now, but mobile, when it started, was very much like doing art for like the 286 and the 386, back in the day, right? That experience carried over almost exactly. So I started putting together working demos, but we needed to start moving them to mobile. And finding mobile programmers was very, very difficult. Most programmers were still working in the AAA space, or they were working in the PC space. Mobile was still kind of considered an upstart. No one was sure if it was going to go anywhere. And then the smartphones came out, and so I had demos to make. But and this is the point in the story where people go, well, why didn't you just hire a programmer? Find a mobile programmer. But I'll point out that artists make like half as much as programmers do. So my actually having the cash to hire a programmer is pretty much a no-go. And there's this thing that happens in the game industry in particular, where people are like, well, if your idea is awesome enough, the programmers will work for you for free. And I'm sure you knows that this is a crock, but this is the kind of thing that you do hear from management, particularly if they're not from the games industry, and if they didn't come up from the bottom, if they came over from advertising, if they came over from business software. That's their proof is in the pudding. If you can talk people into building this for free, then you have a great idea, right? But it doesn't work out that well at the end of the day. The other problem I ran into is that I'm in the Bay Area, which is a target-rich environment. We are ground zero for the deepest pockets in the industry. There's points where if you could program for iOS, they were raining money down on you, right? I mean, if you're a small startup studio, you can't compete with that, right? It's pay Bay Area rent prices, or work on this mobile game and eat ramen for a couple of months. So I've had probably 50% of my programmers have been poached by either Zynga, Facebook, or Google over the past few years. And on the one hand, I'm happy to see them go, right? They're getting a big fat paycheck, they're getting free food, they're getting, to work on a campus where, they can literally build anything they want. So I can't begrudge them taking the jump, but it meant I had to come up with a different way to do this, right? So I started by learning how to code myself. And this sort of feeds back again, because of the way that I got into art, and because of the way that I got into games by doing this sort of self-assemblage, I approached coding with the same attitude, right? It wasn't, I'm going to go back to school and take computer classes and learn how to, set up my white space properly and how to assemble all of my libraries in the proper order. It was, I need this thing to move. Who can tell me out there in the world on the internet, how can I find the information to make this object move from point A to point B? Okay, so I take that piece of information and I put it in my library. So there's huge gaps in my programming knowledge. And I do find as I meet and talk to other programmers that this is not at all uncommon, right? You tend to work on if you've come out with a CS degree, you have a broad base of really useful knowledge. But then as you get into games, you tend to target. You have people who specialize in AI programming, and you have people who specialize in back-end programming, and you have some people who deal predominantly with user interface and user experience programming. And so you will find, even as the industry continues to grow, that there's holes in everybody's knowledge. And so I said, all right, let's have at it. Let's keep moving forward, as it were. And so that's sort of the way I ended up transitioning from one. It was that repeated connection with programming that made it possible. And it's, a lot of these things when I was doing them didn't seem relevant to the outside viewer, right? I mean, why is an English major playing with Spark stations, right? Why does the cow animator need to know how to connect the UI to the database to bring up character inventory, right? Why on earth is a mobile game designer up at the wall of shame at Black Hat? Which actually I haven't done, that's on my bucket list, but that's a story for another day. So that's, the transition for me from art to programming came about as a combination of a matter of necessity and with all things access, right? I had programmers that I worked with who were happy to show me how to do something or said, oh yeah, you just need to tweak this variable here. Or here's a write-up that somebody did that was really good on how to use lerps in Unity, right? And so all of that, those puzzle pieces, I was able to put together to sort of make the jump from being an artist to being a programmer. So that's the story of how I changed paths in the industry. Let me give you a little bit of information on sort of how that fed into what we're doing now at Bushigo and some of the things that we've done to keep our studio up and running in the Bay Area, which is, I think we've done pretty good over the past couple of years. We're definitely not the biggest studio out there. We're definitely not the smallest studio out there, but we still have the lights on, and we're still able to keep producing product on a slow but regular basis. Now, Bushigo is a Unity development house, so we use Unity exclusively. We develop for iOS, Android, and Windows Phone. Windows Phone takes a little extra fancy dancing, but by and large, like everything else, Unity has a very solid conversion. Most of the time, when we have to go back and change the code for Windows, it's because of something clever we invented. If we stick with the stuff that everybody knows how to do, how to translate, meshes from point A to point B, how to work with the physics, all that kind of stuff, that goes beautifully to pretty much any of the platforms that Unity exports to. It's when you start getting weird. So we do QuickTime events in our games, and we've come up with a method by which we can call these from within Unity, and they play out either usually using the built-in video player on whatever device that you're on. Windows Phone doesn't like this very much, however. Microsoft has that particular piece locked down, so we had to do some clever engineering to get around it. But by and large, it's a pretty simple transition to make. So what we've done is we've built a modular system for our game design and for our game execution. It's hard to get a programmer full-time when you're paying them in equity and pizza. And I don't like to get people to work for equity and pizza. I would much rather pay people than try to convince them that this is the coolest thing since sliced bread. Because this is the games industry, right? It's got a 50-50 chance of being as awesome as I am absolutely convinced that it will be. So I'd rather pay you for your time and your expertise than run out the dog and pony show. So what we do is we compartmentalize everything. So we build out our design document, and then we take it and we chop it up into discrete pieces. And by now we have a pretty good idea of what types of code needs to have what types of hooks to be able to intersect with another piece of code. And so we will bring in specialists, we will bring in programmers that we know have experience with doing this type of product or that type of product, and we will give them a piece of the game to make. And a lot of this comes out of the fact that, people may have 2 weeks and they'll be on vacation, and they're like, all right, you know what, you can't pay me as much as I'd like, but I'm on vacation, I'd rather be programming, I can build you this small, discrete piece, right? And that's the big fear of all contractors, is that you sign up to do one thing, and then it grows, and they're like, can you just add an extra line of code here? And can you just change that one little thing there? And suddenly what was a weekend-long programming project or a weekend-long art project, this happens easily as often to artists as it does to programmers, turns into 6 months. And you have no idea where the time went. And you didn't get paid 6 months worth by a long shot. And so we break everything up and we send it out to different professionals. And a lot of times they're people we've worked with, either at major studios or we've worked with in the past. We do bring people in a lot, but there is a 50-50 chance that they will ghost before they're a piece of the project, whether it be an artist or whether it be a programmer. A lot of time, it takes a lot of discipline to be able to work from home or to be able to work after hours when you would rather be out going and getting a beer with friends, or when you would, when you've got 3 kids and your wife would like you to come home so that, she can have a glass of wine and take a nap. So the programmers that we go to first are ones that we have worked with and that we know have the discipline necessary to execute what we have asked them to execute within the time frame and without disappearing. We do weekly stand-ups on Skype. We have a Skype channel that has been open for 5 years. It's a group channel. We bring people in and take them out. And then anytime anybody has a question, they throw it into the Skype channel. And so you check it all the time. It's just open on your computer. So if you're an artist, they'll put your name in there. Hey, Bob, I ran into this thing. And it keeps a constant open line of communication without being as invasive as having everybody's webcams on. And you learn people's hours. You know that your 2D artist has a day job working for App Annie, and so they can't possibly be online until 6 o'clock in the evening. And so you may tweak your schedule to work around that time frame. We have programmers that we've brought in to handle back-end engineering from the Ukraine, and they work almost on an opposite schedule that we do. So as our team is going to bed and closing up shop for the night, they are coming online, which on the one hand is a little frustrating because if you want to have a face-to-face conversation, you have to be up at like 4 in the morning. But on the other hand, we can keep production going almost 24 hours without impinging on any individual's sleep. Right? The team here in the US can complete the project to a certain point, then they can hand it off to the Ukraine and they can complete it to a certain point, and then they might hand it off to a UX developer that we work with who's in India, and then so we can push it around the clock if we have to. We try not to, because that does get it doesn't get grating. What happens is you sort of get this zone going, and then if something goes wrong, or if something goes too far off track, the whole thing goes whoosh, and you have to start over, and you sort of have to build everybody back into it. The other benefit to working like this is that it makes the products that we're working on for clients a little more secure. Because we do pull in programmers and artists from all over the world, sometimes we have clients who are concerned. Right, they're not comfortable having programmers who live in Russia working on their project. They're afraid something's going to get stolen. They're afraid that the work they're paying for is going to be repurposed. But by having everything compartmentalized, most clients are okay with that. It's like, okay, this programmer's only going to have that piece. They're not going to have your entire game, or they're not going to have access to your entire app. So that makes it a little bit easier dealing with clients who are worried about different levels of security. And we've run into clients who absolutely will not allow you to work with overseas contractors at all. Everything has to be done within the U.S. In some cases, everything has to be done within the building, and you're not allowed to use anybody outside at all. But those are sort of extreme cases, usually because somebody's not terribly inexperienced, or usually because they're coming from a military background, or they're coming from programming in cybersecurity or something like that. We have a core team of 3 people. So it's myself, my co-founder Doug, and then our designer Matt. And between the 3 of us, when everything comes back, then we assemble everything in the home studio. So we talk to all of the individual team members. We make sure that changes that need to get made, And it is a little more complicated a process, but it allows us to not only keep things affordable for us and for the contractors we bring in, but it does allow us to start and stop development without losing a lot of time, right? Because we know these pieces have been completed, these pieces need to be completed. And if we have to halt in the middle, we have a clear point to come back to and clear task lists that have already been executed. And it also makes it easier to bring in new people, because if we bring in a new artist and that artist ghosts, then we know exactly what has to be passed off to another artist. And that makes it lets us keep rolling when things go wrong, or we might otherwise not be able to. We do have some kind of stickler rules about things like commenting the code, partly because we hire people for short periods of time, and ideally we want them to come back and finish the next piece that is related to their first piece, but we can't get people back, right? A lot of times we're working with people in their off hours or on their vacations. So, keeping the code commented and keeping the artwork commented as well. And I understand if you're building code, if you're building art assets, you don't want to hand it off to a company and then have somebody else muck with it after the fact. We make it very clear when we hire people that your stuff is going to be mucked with after the fact. We've got you for 2 weeks. Someone's going to have to make adjustments to it. That's just the way that this all plays out. And so artists, as opposed to programmers, don't comment. That's what I found. Artists give you this, right? You say, I want the layered Photoshop file. So they give you the layered Photoshop file with 10,000 layers, all of which have names like shape 47, shape, the green shape on the left.
Which one's highlighted?
No, well, exactly, but it takes time. It takes time, right? Somebody has to go through and click on each of those pieces, right, to see how it all plays out.
So rename them.
And then and then rename. And if you don't rename them, then when you open it up again, you look at it and you're like, oh my god, I didn't rename anything. I don't remember where anything is. So we do try to be very upfront with our contractors. It's like, look, we're going to take this, and we may tear it apart, and we may have to rejigger it further down the line. But being open and transparent that way helps us get the same people back over and over again, because they've seen the care that we take with the assets once they've come back to us. And if we run into something that we think is going to wreck the asset, we'll go back to the programmer, or we'll go back to the artist and we'll renegotiate. We'll say, look, we hired you to do X, Y, and Z, right? But all of a sudden Y is over here and Y needs to be done. Do you have the time to do it? And here's what we can afford to pay for it. Do you have the time? Do you have the inclination? All of these kinds of things take extra time, right? There's extra negotiating time. There's extra conversations that have to be had. But it makes for a better product at the end of the day, and it makes for a group of people that can continue to work together, even on very different projects over very long periods of time. So right now, our focus is narrative-driven games, but like any small game studio, we do pick up work. We will develop apps for other companies. We will develop apps for corporate interests, and partly in order to keep the lights on, partly to keep everybody engaged, right? So I've got a pool of probably 10, 15 people who have worked for us, and as long as I can keep throwing them things to do, I can keep their interest, right? And they'll come back and work again and again. So even if a project isn't quite up their tree, even if it's a small project, staying in that constant communication with the contractors that you work with works very well. And the way we do it, we're not big into sending out Christmas cards or fruit baskets or that kind of stuff. But we do bring them back and say, hey, I have this project, are you interested? And if they're not interested, they say so. And we're like, all right, we have this project, 3 weeks later, are you interested? And so we keep the line of communication open. One of the big lessons, I think, is right? And this is a little more particular to artists, because people are under the impression, and I've had producers come to me and say, well, why don't you just go to the and hire you know, some 18-year-old to draw out 25 Magic the Gathering style cards for $50 each. Right. I mean, these are you know, there's this presumption that you can get everything for free, but that's not the right presumption to be making. And if your studio is going to be viable, if you're going out and getting free work and getting free assets, you're not a viable studio, right? You're a con game, right?
You're gonna get a lawsuit.
Yeah, at best you're going to get a lawsuit. At worst, you know, people are going to start talking about you in the industry, and you're never going to be able to hire anybody again. So it's, you know, so always pay your people. You may not be able to pay them industry scale, right? You may not be able to pay, you know, the programmer who's going to be making your, you know, your Centaur run across the screen with the same amount he'd be making at Zynga and Google, right? You may not be able to pay the artist quite as much as you feel that they should be making, but paying something and giving them the choice of saying, look, this is the amount of work we know needs to be done. This is the amount of money we have to budget. Giving them the choice to either take that job or not makes a big difference, right? And when you do have the money, you know, pay them what they're worth, right? Because word gets out, and people in the industry know. LucasArts, for a long time, their game studio was the most popular studio in the Bay Area. And it wasn't because they paid everybody more than any other studio. It was because it was an awesome place to work. And they made sure that the team members all, they did things together. And if you had kids, you brought your kids into the studio, they had on-site daycare, and they had all of these things.
Wow.
All of these connections and all of these, business-wise, you'd call them perks, right? Sort of the compensation for not getting paid as much, right? But word gets out, and people will come to you and will regard you more seriously if they know that you will pay, right? Even if it's not as much as they might want to get, or not as much as they might get somewhere else. Knowing that you will fulfill your end of the contract, as opposed to the contract is done, and oh, I haven't got paid by the publisher yet. Oh, we haven't brought in enough money to you know, cover your expenses yet. And then then you stop taking their phone calls. And then all of a sudden, you know, a year has gone by or 2 years have gone by, and you've never gotten paid for that project that you did, right? So when people know that you are reliable and that you will do what you say you will do, even if it's not at this level, right? Even if you're too small to make that level, word will get out there, and people will come and find you to see if you have anything that needs to be done, which is very helpful. The other thing we've done is we've built our own custom library. Much like Alston Brown hates unitaskers, we try not to contract for scripts that do just one thing. We try to think of a broader use case. So for example, we have a timer script in Unity, and it's probably 4 pages long. And those of you who program know that you don't need 4 pages to execute a timer script, right? But there's a whole bunch of additional components to it that are expressed in the inspector bar that we can turn on and off depending on the game that we're making. So we may have, we know if it's going to be an Android game, we know if we push this button here, then no matter what Android screen it goes on, the UI elements will rearrange themselves. Right, or we know that it's programmed in there, you have 4 color choices. So when you go into negative numbers, what color are you going to choose? Are you going to have it be, you know, white, or are you going to have it be red, or are you going to have it be blue? So when we had it built, we built it with several use cases in mind. It's a little bit clunkier, but if we know we're not going to use the bottom half of that script, then we can comment that code out or simply remove it and be left with just the pieces that we need. Which allows us to reuse pieces over and over again rather than having to have them custom coded from the ground up. The other advantage to that is we have a framework for our programmers and our artists to work with. Our artists know that since this is the code for the user experience, this is where the assets go, period, right? That's where they've got to go on the screen. And so so they know that if they're building a product for us, they're going to need these types of assets in these positions. And even if it's a product 2 or 3 years down the line, they have some idea of what they're getting in for. And the same with the programmers. If we ask the programmers to work with our pre-existing library, then they know how to code to mesh with that pre-existing library. And so when we bring them back on another project, they're already up and running, and they don't have to go through and relearn everything. They know we're going to use this timer script, and that they have permission to cut pieces out or to make adjustments to it. But that's sort of the framework that we're providing for them to work on. BizDev. When you start your own studio, there is the idea that everybody on your team must be an artist or a programmer. But I cannot stress the importance of a good business development person enough. And this is the point that I'm at right now, being the CEO for Bushido. I no longer have time to execute art assets or code assets or even really do the assemblage. I'm becoming the bottleneck for my own production cycle because I have to spend time hunting down contracts, and I have to spend time chasing down leads. And that takes, and it's not, the kind of productive time you have when you're programming or the kind of productive time when you're in the zone and drawing. It's a lot of waiting. Right? It's a lot of talking to this person's secretary and talking to that other person and then finding out that, oh, they'll be back on. So it becomes this huge management task that in order to pull in contracts, somebody's got to do that work. And, the producers and the publishers and the venture capitalists and the angels they have office hours. And you have to be able to be available during those office hours to do that business development work. So if you can bring on a business development person, I would do that as early as possible. There's a tendency for teams to feel like the biz dev person or the contracts person isn't quite doing as much work as the rest of the team is doing. Unless they're sitting there playing, cow clicker, then, they are, if they're bringing in contracts and they're bringing in work, then they are doing as much work as the rest of the team. It's just a different kind of work. It's just talking and waiting and tracking and listening and taking people out to lunch and agreeing to meet at that one coffee shop where you met that one time, which is the kind of work that BizDev does, and ultimately half of my job these days is talking. Just talking, all the time. I was never a big talker before, but now that I'm running a studio, I had to learn how to let my mouth run without my brain necessarily being attached to it all the time. The other thing you have to do when you're working with a small studio, you have to be able to roll with it, right? Contracts get canceled all the freaking time. If you're lucky, you can put in a kill clause, right? That says, okay, if you cancel this contract, you owe us $50,000 as a kill fee, right? Those exist. They're hard to get in there. You usually have to have a rock star on your team, or you have to have an IP that they desperately want in order to get that in there. But stuff gets canceled, and it's not even for good reasons all the time. It's just, you know what, we've decided to make a shift, and we're not going to produce anything that doesn't involve ponies. And so, you may have to completely rejigger your entire game to handle ponies, or it may just be canceled out of hand. And this happens to everybody. John Romero's Loop Drop was halfway through developing, like halfway, 3/4 of the way through developing a game called Ravenswood, and it got dropped. And this is John Romero, right? You wouldn't think that anybody would cancel a contract with somebody with that length of experience, but it happens all the time. So you've really got to be able to roll with it. If you have a half-completed game, complete it if you can, right? They've terminated the contract. They own what rights that they negotiated for. You have a huge code base that they paid for. Do something with it. Make something cool. Reskin it, right? I mean, you've got the resources. You just have to not be in shock when things go wrong, really. And it's possible to shock out an entire team, and people spend like a week being zombies because something got canceled, or because a producer went storming up and down the hallways of your studio ranting about the demo that you just turned in. And these things happen. If you can roll with it and be flexible then you can usually come out the other side. I hate this one. I would much rather spend the time completing a game and making sure that everything is right and clean and perfect. But we're in mobile. By the time I spend 6 months making a game gorgeous, Apple has thrown some new hinky bit into metal or into their development process that I now have to go back and recode for, right? So you need to get things iterated quickly. You need to get things executed and pushed out the door. The audience has been trained to understand that the first release of a game, particularly if you put the word beta on your icon, is going to have problems. If you encourage feedback from your audience, you can actually turn this into a benefit, right? You can develop a community. People like to be part of things. They like to contribute. So, you know, there was the term was running around for a while, minimum viable build, right? You build the game so that it functions, so that it works well, doesn't look too awful. You push it out there, and then you start collecting feedback. A lot of big studios release in places like Germany and Canada and England first to get feedback from those markets before they release in the United States. So they'll push a beta out elsewhere in the world to bounce it off people.
Hollywood's been doing that with China.
Exactly. And so it's become this, just get it done and get it out the door. And then if it turns out that people like it, or if there's something about people like, then you can spend the time making it perfect. And your audience will be delighted because they see it as they're contributing to the awesomeness of this game. But you do have to continue moving quickly. Now, if you're working in PC games, if you're working in AAA games, that's a little different, right? AAA games have a 5-year development cycle these days. PC games are a different animal, right? If you're doing the PC version of a AAA game, that's one thing. If you're doing the next Undertale, that's something entirely different, right? But moving quickly will help solve some of the problems that you run into with art and with code. If you hold on to your project too long, you may find that somebody scooped you, right? If you're releasing a game about ninja dogs, you may find that somebody else was developing a game with ninja cats, and if whoever gets it out the door first is usually the winner. So that speeding up of the process is becoming necessary. It does mean there's more mistakes. It does mean that stuff ships that maybe shouldn't be shipping quite yet. But because of the bandwidth and because everybody's computers are now hooked to the internet, you can push a patch. You can push a fix. And people expect to see patches and fixes. Even if you don't change anything major, on their mobile device when somebody sees, oh, I need to update the game, and they push the button, they see a new game. Even if the only thing that you've done is change the character's shoes from red to blue, right? They're going to feel like they got something new in that game. So you can use that, you can turn a negative, which is the speed at which we have to develop these days, into a positive by using it as a re-engagement point with people who've downloaded your product. And I think that's going to conclude my talk and my tips for today. I think we move to questions. Does anybody have questions?
Hey, I use that. You have a copy on you?
Which one? I don't have any copies on me today, but
Game Salad?
Game Salad, I do not have a copy with me.
I've got like 4 prototypes on my iPad made with that game right now.
Nice. This text is a game design text as opposed to programming or how to use Game Salad text. But I will if you drop me an email, I can send you a copy. Okay. Yeah.
What would you say would be good things to learn if your end goal is to be project management for video games?
So for project management, one of the most important things that project management does is time management. I would recommend, if not spending time as an artist or a programmer, spend time working with them so you can get a good sense of how long it takes to program this type of thing, or how long it takes to create this type of art asset. Because that, I think, that's the most important thing that they do, and it's also where things can go horribly, horribly wrong. Because at the end of the day, honestly, we're all guessing as to how long something's going to take. If you go to your artist and say, hey, I need 25 bobbleheads. How long is that going to take you? And they're thinking, well, okay, if I do it with this kind of art style, and I use this piece of software, and I'm on vacation for 2 weeks, I can have it done in 2 weeks, right? And then they get pneumonia.
Yeah.
Or it comes back from the higher ups that we're no longer going to be using voxels, we're going to be using vectors, right? And so the time management is not only figuring out how long it takes to create a certain type of asset, it's also building in extra time to account for these kinds of problems. And many small studios will cut that time as short as possible, right? You're facing down Trip Hawkins, who is telling you, I need this game in 2 weeks. And in the back of your head, you're like, I need 6 weeks to complete this game. But you're standing across the table from Trip Hawkins and he's holding a check out. And you're like, all right, 2 weeks, we're good to go. Right? So you don't want, so you want to have an idea, an honest idea. And if somebody is offering you money to do something in like way too short a time, you can tell them to piss off. Honestly, you can say, you know what, that's not enough time to go.
Can you build me the next Angry Birds in about a week?
Well, because what happens is when people are hiring you, they want to get you cheaper and they want to get you to work faster than anybody else. So you have to follow Mr. Scott's rule of engineering, right? You always double the time that it takes to do anything. If it's going to take, if your artist says, that's going to take me 8 days to build that asset, you go back up the line and say it's going to take 16 days, because first of all they're going to negotiate you down to like 12, right? But second of all, you know that 8 days is an ideal situation, right? Because nobody ever pitches for a bad situation. Nobody ever thinks, well, what if I break my leg skiing in the middle of this? Or what if somebody runs over my car with a tank? And the thing is, these kind of weird things happen. We're in crunch mode right now for GDC, and my Facebook feed is full of the weirdest disasters I have ever seen. One of the studios I used to work for has a raccoon in their server farm. And it's all happening because GDC starts in 4 days. This is when the weird stuff comes out of the woodwork. The thing is that the years that it doesn't happen, you don't notice because you're so happy that nothing happened and didn't notice. But then every so often we have these things happen, and you're like, how the heck is this? Is this coming out of the woodwork? When I worked for Starsphere, at like 11 o'clock one night, I get an emergency phone call from the CEO. Apparently, the restaurant underneath the studio was on fire. So all of our stuff is, all of our computers, all of our gear is up there. And so we're all online pulling backups as fast as we possibly can, because the tape drives are in there too, and like everything is and fortunately, they put out the fire before it got to all of our gear. But, this kind of stuff, will throw your production schedule. And then when you go back to THQ to say, I'm sorry, there's a raccoon in our server farm, you're like, well, we're really sorry about that, but, that's going to cost you 15% off your next payment because you missed a milestone, right? There is no wiggle room on their end. You set your milestones, you meet your milestones, you miss your milestones, tough, right? They're not going to fiddle that for you unless you've already produced, Bioshock. Or something of equivalent rock star power. Yes.
When you made the transition from art to code, did you have people in your life say like, "Are you giving up on your dreams?" or "Are you giving up?" Like,
oh yeah.
How did you respond to that? I find it baffling, and I'm dealing with that now.
It's there's the way I always pitched it was it's the same dream, it's just a different door.
Ah.
Right. It's the people who say things like that are usually people who are not in games, right? Or who are not in your field in general. They don't understand that you can still arrive at the end goal, right? I mean, the end goal for almost all of us is to be game developers. Whether we are programmers, whether we are artists, whether we are audio, right? Whether we are production. Being a game developer and being part of a game that is produced and put out into the world is the goal. That is the dream, right? It's not necessarily spending 24 hours on a ramen-filled coding binge trying to get this thing done. That's not a dream. That's just the method by which we get there. And so when I ran it, and I absolutely ran into that. I'm like, you know, people are like, oh my God, you already have, you know, a college degree. Why are you learning to program, right? And I'm like, well, because that's what I need to do to make this happen. That's the next step I needed to take. And so, you know, it won't necessarily stop them, but
No,
it
but
does
having a
help.
catchphrase, same dream, different door, I
Yeah.
mean, bam.
There you go. You can
Great.
drop it and walk on.
Yeah.
So yeah, it sounds like with your business model of having such a decentralized kind of team organization, that like a huge emphasis on networking is probably like a super important thing.
Mhm.
Do you have any like horror stories about just a really bad like relationship that happened out of that decentralized nature? Like,
We did, you know, we made a mistake once upon a time, and so when you go out and you hunt for new contractors, a lot of times what you'll get is you'll get responses from other teams that, you know, are looking to pick up, and they treat this as you are a publisher and we want you to pay us to make your entire product. And so we had negotiated with the team so that they would handle a portion of the product and we would handle the other portion of the product. But it ultimately did not work out. They held assets hostage. And they said, well, you know, we think we need to renegotiate because this is more work than we expected. We're going to hold on to those assets and not let you have them until we renegotiated, right? And so it became a very fractious relationship. And ultimately, we just let them go. You know, there was no... They had their own team, they had their own culture and their own process, which didn't mesh with the way that we were doing things. We thought it would be great, right? Okay, we've got a team. This is, you know, 3 people. They have worked together on 2 or 3 games. They should know each other by now. They know who gets pissed off when you slurp your coffee. They know, you know, how everybody works together. But the truth of the matter is that wasn't what we ran into, right? It became problematic, and we had to call it off. It took probably 6 months out of our development time on that project, which was not good at all. Yes.
When you were making the transition from art and working on art to code and such, did you ever find occasions where you'd like, say for example, like I myself paid for a 10-day training course in Maya because it didn't have tools. Would you ever find that resourceful, or did you ever think of going back to college and stuff like that, or learning more art skills, or like filling in those gaps?
I've found that the gaps are usually there for a reason. I tend to end up revisiting certain processes and certain types of code repeatedly. I need to use translations. I need to use lerps. I need to be able to cause integers to cross over from this script to that script and then call something on a third script over here. So for building demos and the type of coding that I do, I don't need that depth of knowledge. I've considered going back and getting it, but you know, up until now, you know, my art degree and now all of my programming skills, and to a certain extent my CEO training, such as it is, has all been going out and finding people who know the thing I need to know and talking to that person. So I'm reverse engineering, you know, what I do, really. And I do the same thing for business development as well, because I find that, you know, you don't need to know all of those things. It might be good if you did, but for me personally, knowing this specific piece here, you know, it's the Sherlock Holmes model, right? I don't need to know that the Earth goes around the sun. That doesn't come into play with the things that I'm building right now. I don't need to know how to talk to an SQL server in China, because that's not part of the types of products that I might build. So while I've considered it, I've usually put it aside. Yes.
What kind of contracts do you have for your core team, and what do you use for your freelancers?
So the core team are all on an equity basis. So we're all co-owners at different levels, and then on top of that, we use a stipend for the core team. So there's X amount per month when we're on contract. If we're not on contract, then the core team doesn't get paid. Most of us have day jobs. I still do contract work on the side. My my IP wrangler works down in Hollywood, so he still does script writing as part of his day job. So so when we're not on the clock for Bushigo, then nobody gets anything. For the individual contractors, those are pretty standard contract. We do try to do hourly contracts as opposed to per project. When we started, we had to do per project because we didn't know how long things would take to build. Now that we've done this for a while, and this feeds back into the project management class, now that we've done this for a while, we know how long it takes for things to do, and so we can say, I need this code built. It's probably going to take 40 hours to get this code written, and so we can account for that, so we have a good idea that we're not just going to be writing checks for months at a time. But if it's something brand new and we've never done before, then we're going to look at it on a per project basis.
Yeah. You said you focus on like narrative building for your mobile games, which kudos to, because I feel like that's severely lacking in the mobile market. How do you feel about that? Because like it seems like the mobile market right now is really dominated with just you can play this for 5 minutes kind of games and cash grab kind of games, pay to win, and for every game that comes out, there's 20 cheap knockoffs that are poorly designed.
Yep.
How do you feel like that's going to progress? And also, it seems like sometimes with the move to smartphones and no real dedicated physical interface for gaming, how that's holding that back.
So for narrative games are actually a better fit for mobile, I think, than they are for PC or even for console. Partly because enough people are now reading on things like the Kindle and they're reading on tablets and phones that spending a long time staring at the screen to get a story component is more natural to people. I mean, I know a lot of people who read ebooks, right? But almost nobody reads ebooks on a big screen like this, right? Most people read it on their tablet or they read it on their Kindle. So for narrative games, I actually think that mobile's a better fit. There's a couple of problems we run into. Number one, it's a blue ocean for narrative games. There's not many of them out there. Most of them get through a couple of episodes and then they fail. We had this happen with Agilis, which was our first game. The thing that we found is for the narrative stuff, you don't necessarily go after a gamer market. The narrative stuff tends to appeal to casual game players, but it also appeals to readers. You are looking at people who are comic book fans. You are looking at people who attend, science fiction conventions. You are looking at people for whom narrative is the thing. And so for us, that's been predominantly an interface shift in how you interact with the story, and it's been a marketing shift. So for example, we're going to be at Silicon Valley Comic Con at the end of the year. So as opposed to trying to get to the Angry Birds players, we're going after the people we know are going to connect with the narrative better and more quickly than somebody who's interested in a big red button game. Narrative is slower, right? You don't get the hockey stick for games unless you're Telltale and you're working with Game of Thrones or you're working with Walking Dead, which is an entirely different machine. So narrative games have to be built slowly and they have to be built over time, which most people don't like to do in mobile. People want to see your game come out, they want to see you release it on a Thursday, and then by Sunday they want to see 100,000 downloads. Right? I mean, that's what they're looking for. That right there is the hallmark of a hit game. So.
Kind of like that.
Yeah.
It's like interactive Edgar Allan Poe. I just
Sure.
read a story with my wife every night before bed.
That's absolutely one
just
way to do it.
Flip the pages and it's got,
Yeah.
sure.
And you get a bit of an interactive component, and you get the storytelling component as well.
Yeah.
Yes, you've been very patient.
I was just wondering, especially if you're not going for a business degree, how one might go about getting like some business skills or understanding that.
So there's a couple different components that go into business. The first one is you have to be willing to sell, and you can learn to sell anywhere, right? I mean, pick up a telemarketing job for one summer and learn how to keep people on the phone. And you're not going to make any money doing it, and it's kind of going to suck, but you're going to learn how to engage people, and you're going to learn how to hold that no off as long as possible, right? And maybe even turn it into a yes. so in my case, when I was working in the brokerage industry during one of those gaps in my backstory, that was where I got my business experience. That was, learning sales, essentially. Learning how to put together a package and then learning how to promote that package to people. The nuts and bolts part of business, portions of it you can learn as you go. Portions of it, they're out there, right? I mean, you can go online and you can, for example, I have contractors, so I work with Intuit to handle my payroll stuff. And they ping me, and they say, hey, you have to get your 1099s out to your contractors before the end of the month, boom. And so those types of systems are out there that will walk you through that component as well. And then if you get deeper into business, it's really hard to do all the business stuff yourself and be an expert in everything, right? You want to bring on an accountant at some point. If you have an accountant who is experienced in games, then they'll understand all the cool stuff you can do with your finances to keep your team alive as long as possible, right? They'll understand how to float cash in this account versus that account and how to make sure that people pay their invoices within 30 days or less. Always make your invoices 30 days, by the way. If you're working as a contractor, the big studios will push them out to 90 days, and you need to put a red line through that, send it back and say, I'm sorry, it's gotta be 30 days or we're not doing this. Most of the time, they don't care. Most of the time, if they can get the 90 days, they'll get it. But if you say 30 days, then they'll redline it and fix it for you. So that's just one of those things that's sort of automatically written in that they want you to work with. If you have a chance to internship with a game studio, sometimes you can target that internship. You say, I want to be in management. Can I be the assistant for this producer, or can I work with the biz dev team over here? So if you're not going to go, for an MBA or a business degree, then getting the hands-on experience somehow, is better. I mean, it could be simple, something as simple as opening an Etsy store and figuring out what you need to do and what you don't need to do, and then, taking that and translating it. My first business was selling limes. I used to go around all the houses, kind of out in the boondocks. Everybody had lime groves. I would collect them and sell them to restaurants. I figured out that there was a big company doing it for, $50 a bag, and I could go pick it myself and sell it for, $40 a bag. And, everybody likes to save money, so, but that was where my business experience, such as it was, started. So it can be built upon. And in the games industry in particular, there are always people who are happy to be advisors. Now, I will point out, in California, advisors cannot be compensated. You are not supposed to give advisors equity. That is a no-no. You are not supposed to pay advisors. They are supposed to be advising you because you have convinced them that you are awesome. There's actually rules in place in California where if you're paying your advisors with equity, you can get into some trouble doing that. So, you can definitely talk to people, and people love to share their specialized knowledge, really. So you can almost definitely find someone who will help you out. Yes?
With your contractors and stuff like that, you said that, through a game development degree, you kind of spider out in those ways and develop different skill sets.
Mm-hmm.
But at least right now, what do you look for in your skill sets beyond personality that actually meshes with your team, actual skills?
So for what we're doing now, I look for prior project experience. It doesn't have to be game dev experience, and it doesn't have to be employed game dev experience. If you have produced a project and can say, I did this within X amount of time with X amount of resources, I will definitely take a serious look. Obviously, if you've worked on AAA, I'm probably going to take you a little less seriously than if you've worked in mobile, because the timelines are so different and the requirements are so different. So somebody who has produced for mobile, definitely. Somebody who codes in C#. If I bring on a rookie, then they have to be willing to learn to code in C#, because we do everything in C#.
Oh, you're an Unity.
Yeah.
So
that's, yeah, it's easier for us.
C#
and it's-
or JavaScript.
Right, and C# for us has always been more robust than JavaScript. So I would have to say, in order of importance, programming language, Experience gathered, so whether or not it's formal or not. Actually, it's bonus points if you've produced a game on your own, or you've developed a game on your own, or gotten like 5 people together in your garage, because that shows me that you have discipline, that you have the discipline to do what we need to do. Studio experience for us is not required. I know a lot of places like to see it, but because of the nature of what we do and the way we do it, if you have the discipline to produce the work, then you have the discipline to produce the work. And I do find that people, both artists and programmers, if they get out of a formal employment situation, there's a period of time where everything just flops, right? When you have to learn to get up at 7 in the morning, have your breakfast, and sit down and produce without somebody sitting over your shoulder. And you know, you go through college, and there is somebody sitting over your shoulder the whole time, right? I mean, it's your instructor, and it's a very light hand, but there is a accountability there. So, so somebody who has proven to be able to work on their own is definitely, I think, a plus in that case as well. So,
For artist skills?
for artist skills, portfolio is first. The quality of the art. If the art fits what we need is a really big one. So there's this thing that we used to say at Art Center. You know, if a producer needs to make the next version of Burger Time, and he looks at 100 different portfolios of varying levels, he will pick the artist who has a picture of a hamburger in their portfolio. If you have a picture of a hot dog, even if it's a better picture than the hamburger, they're still going to pick the hamburger, right? Because that is what they need at that point. Most producers will not. So when you go through art school, you learn to copy other art styles, right? You learn to work like Kandinsky, or you learn to work like Michelangelo, or you learn to be able to replicate these different visual looks. But generally speaking, it's presumed that what ends up in your portfolio is what makes you happy. So we're not going to hire you, even if your work is excellent, if the visual style or the visual content doesn't fit the game that we have in mind at that moment, then we'll regard it as not being fit. And I've I've made the attempt more than once to hire an artist and then bring them over to a different art style. And usually what happens is it makes the artist unhappy and it makes the producer unhappy, and then the end result is somewhere in between. So portfolio is the absolute number one. So look and feel relevance to the game that we're developing. And if we don't have a look and feel yet, then we will judge it based on quality. Relevant skills. So if we need an animator, we're going to look for animations. If we need a concept artist, we're going to look for concept art. It's okay to have multiple things in your portfolio, particularly if you're just starting out. Because that's what happens when you're just starting out. You do a few concept pieces, you do a few animations, you do a couple of 3D models. And so we expect, if you've got that breadth in your portfolio, then you're new to the scene. We look for experience in games. Again, does not have to be studio experience. Studio experience is a bonus. Freelance experience is better. And game experience for artists is especially important, because in order to get art assets into the game, you have to understand things like transparency levels. And you have to understand that, you know, if you palletize something to 257 colors, then that first pixel is going to be your transparency color. And if you happen to have that pixel being black, your ninja is going to come out looking like a red face mask and a couple of fancy shoes. And so somebody who has already beaten their heads against a game engine is I think, going to be key in what we look for. So.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but.
Okay.
Any words, last words?
Well, I mean, if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions and definitely do what I can to help out. And that's about it.